And it is contained and thwarted by a combination of political maneuvering in parliament and then straight military intervention once it becomes necessary. By the time we get to 2000, 2004, it's quite a different story. And the main reason for that is that Aristide and Lavalas have solved both these problems. Okay, of all the things, if you're coming to this new, and I know for many of you this will be very familiar, but if you're coming to it new, these are the two key things, in my opinion, to understand about the new sequence. Is that both of these problems have been solved by 2000, by Lavalas and Aristide and his associates. The military problem is solved when Aristide comes back in 94, 95. This is another one of the most controversial things about Aristide, on the left at least, was he right to come back in the company of the US Marines? You remember that Clinton sends him back in a great glow of righteousness when he sends the Marines in to restore democracy to Haiti in September and October 1994. One of the greatest moments of Clinton's life, apparently, making that little speech. After 3 years of pure and simple hypocrisy, when they basically held a gun to Aristide's head, forced him to make a number of very painful concessions while colluding actively in the systematic massacre of his supporters. In any case, though, Aristide decides, rightly or wrongly, that he has no real alternative to this, that this is the only way that he can get some support to provide cover for one of his key objectives when he comes back, which is to eliminate the Haitian army. The first thing that Aristide does, the focus of his attention when he comes back in the autumn of 1994, is the demobilization of the Haitian army. And of all the things that he managed to do in what was left of his first term, that's the one that is probably the most significant and the most popular among ordinary Haitian people. It changed the balance of power, possibly forever, in Haiti. It meant that there wasn't then this extra parliamentary, extra political mechanism that could step in and restore the status quo if something like a political movement started to threaten real change. And without that move, I'm sure, and Aristide himself insists on it, I'm sure he's right, there's no way that the person who succeeds Aristide as president in 1996, René Preval, there's no way he could have finished his term. There's no way Aristide would have come back for a second term. I mean, the demobilization of that army opened the door to something like a new political chapter in Haiti's history. So it was a crucial achievement. It was also extremely difficult and fraught, compromised from the beginning by the fact that the military power that was occupying the country was, of course, the United States, which had created and monitored this army that was being in the process of that Aristide was busy demobilizing. The US had said, well, we'll accept that the army be reduced, and it said that maybe we can have an army, much smaller, 1,500 troops, something like that. But we will train them, we will organize them, we will control them. This demobilization of the army, pure and simple, was not at all part of the plan. And that meant that the US, became, one of the reasons why the US becomes increasingly hostile to Aristide over the course of the 1990s, is because they thought they were losing control on the security, situation. They lost control of the army, and then Aristide puts in place a new police force, which the Americans can only partly control. They do, with Canadian help as it happens, they do oversee the training of this new force. The CIA interference, in fact, is so flagrant that the head of the Justice Department program that was overseeing the training, a woman called Jan Stromson, she resigns in disgust in the late 90s. It was that flagrant. But nevertheless, Aristide's people were able to have some degree of control over their own police force, which means that the army is no longer there as a kind of bulwark of the status quo. That's a very important development. The second thing that's just as important is that when, back in 1991, the interests of the elite were represented by this plethora of small political parties that disrupted the parliamentary process, in 2000 the situation is totally different. Starting in late 96 and then building over 97, Aristide and his closest associates put in place a new political organization called Famille Lavalas, the Lavalas family, which I think by any standard, and again it's far from perfect, there are opportunists in it, there is corruption, there are problems of different kinds, we can talk about that again later. But it is really without any precedent, I think, in Haitian history, the first serious political organization that had representation across the board, all over the country, that mobilized many thousands of people in small famille, little cells, small groups, that were well organized, that were disciplined, that put their heads together to develop a national agenda. Over 2 years, there were meetings at different levels that compiled what became a national agenda that you can read easily. It's available in libraries. A 200-page book called Investir dans l'humain, Investing in People. And that became the election platform, the program in the next big round of elections in May 2000. And by the time that they fight those elections in May 2000, Famille Lavalas is in a position to wage an electoral campaign at every level of government, in all the municipalities and the regions, all of the parliamentary seats, the Senate seats, the presidency, and so on, and they win an overwhelming victory. They win 70 to 75% of the vote. That translates with a system that, in fact, discourages. It's not a first-past-the-post system like here in Canada or in Britain or the US. Despite that, they get 72 out of 83 seats in the parliament. And the biggest, the most significant of the various opposition parties that have been thwarting Preval, that have been stifling the legislative agenda in the last year or so of Aristide's government, the OPL, the Organisation du Peuple en Lutte, by this stage, these are people who had collaborated to some extent with Aristide when they thought they could profit from his popularity, people who had turned against him though quite quickly when they realized that that was a dead end. The OPL gets 1 seat. Okay? In other words, the traditional opposition, the old opposition parties are wiped out completely, and the new ones, the new quasi-Lavalas parties, the ones that had divided and disrupted the Lavalas political project are gone. They're decimated. And now you have a totally new situation. You have a government led by a very popular figure whose moral authority was basically intact, who was still widely associated, and certainly even in the international press, with Mandela, with the tradition of Martin Luther King, with the civil rights movement here in the United States, poised, with a legislative program that was clear, that was well worked out, with a comfortable, in fact massive parliamentary mandate, poised on the brink of real social change, with no army to stop it. And it's at that moment that you need a new strategy of containment, and that's what the bulk of this book, Down in the Flood, is about. Is that how did the people who felt threatened by that, how did they respond? What did they do? How did they contain this new threat now that they didn't have an army and they didn't have political factionalism, to rely on? And just say parenthetically, because at this point, people who are skeptical about this say, well, come on, why would the United States or Canada or France or even Haitian League, why would they be worried? What Lavalas is pretty moderate, which is true. They weren't, firebrand socialists. Their policies were relatively moderate. Why would the United States, in particular, be interested? Where's the oil? What's the payoff? What's the strategic interest? And it's important to say that there are important strategic interests. People get a little stuck on oil sometimes. There's more to life than oil. There are 3 reasons I would just mention as a brief answer to this question. The first is economic, and I don't think this is the most important, but there is an economic imperative here, which is that precisely because Haiti is so poor, the wages, the minimum wages that you pay for people doing assembly work in sweatshops and factories, is the absolute basement. It's the floor seat. It is the starvation rate. The current minimum wage in Haiti is about $1.80 a day, not per hour. Per hour is 10 cents or 11 cents or something, possibly a bit more now. That's useful if you want to make a lot of money making T-shirts like Gildan Activewear does. It's a big subcontractor now in Haiti, or people who make jeans. Wrangler makes a lot of jeans in Haiti. American U.S. Army uniforms, medical clothing, that kind of thing is made in Haiti. Baseballs used to be made in Haiti precisely because they're so laborious to make, so much work. But more important than that is that you can use Haiti as a threat. If you have a light assembly process, making T-shirts in Honduras or Mexico or somewhere like that, and you can always say to your people, if they start talking about a trade union or some other similarly reckless plan, you can say, if you persist with this, well, we'll just move. We'll go to Haiti, we'll go to Bangladesh, but Haiti's right here. You see, it's much easier. So that, I think, it has its uses. And USAID, if you look at one of the constants of USAID funding, is always to insist that there be no changes to the minimum wage, that there be no changes to the investment climate, which basically allows companies to repatriate profits, without having to pay any costs, without having to conform to virtually any regulations that require, there are essentially no taxes on foreign investors for 15 years after you set up business. I mean, it is it's just like open business for international exploitation. So that's the first thing. And I think it's probably more important in terms of a regional impact than it is in Haiti itself. The situation is so desperate in Haiti that the light assembly sector, which is the main sweatshop sector, has fallen to, I think there's about 30,000 workers there now. It used to be 80,000. That means that the wages can be even lower, and you have this huge reserve army of labor, right? All of them competing for these jobs. The salary by 2001 was 20% of what it was back in 1980. And back in 1980 it was already pathetic. It was $4 a day or something. We've reduced people now to 20% of what they were earning in 1980. This is absolutely phenomenal. The You know, I mentioned a moment ago that people in the 1960s, 70s were making, you know, were living on maybe $800 a year, something like that, maybe $2 or $3 a day. The current rate is about 400, you know, 430. You know, in other words, it went from 800 already desperate, it's fallen in half. So that's the first thing, the simple, brute economic assault on Haiti, so that it serves as a kind of, you know, a sort of a place of exploitation of last resort, if you want to think of it that way. That's the first reason, and I think it's significant. Second is the old domino theory, the old threat of a bad example, that if a place like Haiti, as desperate as it is, was able to get some kind of grip on its political future and show that even in a place like Haiti it was possible to make a difference, to build slowly but surely, as the first Lavalas government tried to do, towards something like practical, progressive social change. What kind of example would that set for other places? For places like Bolivia, for places like Ecuador, for places like Paraguay? You know, would it, and I think that's exactly what did happen, in fact, that it's clear that some of these countries did take inspiration from Lavalas. Remember, Aristide's elected the same year that the Sandinistas are thrown out of Nicaragua after a very long campaign, which all of you will know, that killed 50,000 plus people, that whole ugly war waged by the Contras against the Sandinistas. In other words, the sort of classical phase of Latin American socialism had really run dry by then, and Famille Lavalas was operating in a kind of vacuum. At that point, there were, you know, Morales and Chavez were not really yet on the picture. Chavez was starting to emerge when Aristide is re-elected, but it's still, you know, in a way, he's in a relatively difficult position. His own position, as you will remember from 2002, is still vulnerable, and so on. So this is the second reason. The threat, if Haiti was able to get some kind of grip, what kind of example would it send? In particular, would it spill over into the Dominican Republic? This is, I think, is very important. There are big, important American economic interests in the DR that have links to the Republican Party. The Fanjul brothers, for example, are two of the biggest donors for the Republicans in Florida, own large hotels and sugar companies and so on in the DR. If Haiti and the Dominican Republic were able to work together, if, you know, those two countries have a long history, it goes back, it's ugly, and it's a real place of colonial divide and rule. If Haiti and the DR were able to collaborate together in more effectively, such that they could form something like, you know, maybe an alliance with, say, Cuba, just a little to the west. They could link up with Venezuela. You know, you could see a genuine shift in the balance of power in the Caribbean, and the way things are going now in Latin America. This would become a genuinely unsettling prospect, I think. So that's the second reason. It's compounded, that second reason, with the domestic effect. You know, there are many immigrant Haitian workers in North America, in Florida, and in New York, and Quebec, of course, who do a lot of the most exploited work, right? The most badly paid crap work that's done in this continent is done by Haitian workers. And if that community is able to mobilize with other immigrants, with other people, tap into an African-American civil rights tradition that had become increasingly militant, you know, in the last year or two of Martin Luther King's life, reactivate that tradition. And it was obvious and explicit in the 1991, 1990. I remember myself, and those of you who were more active in the African-American struggle will remember this going back much further. That was an obvious connection. People linked Aristide, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X automatically. Then they would track it back to Lumumba and various others. That was a very dangerous connection. It was important to stop that process it's important that the Haitian immigrant population here, for example, be isolated, that they accept their destiny, which is to be exploited without any chance of change. So that's the second reason. And the third one, just summarizing this quickly, has to do with this threat of liberation theology. I mentioned this briefly, the T d'Église that were a very important part of the original Lavalas movement. The Americans were seriously worried about this. I spoke to American military analysts who were, you know, the leading, this guy particularly Lawrence Rockwood, Captain Lawrence Rockwood, who was the head of American military intelligence at the time of the invasion in 1994. And he said that all through the 80s, when they were working in Latin America, they were being briefed by the CIA and so on. What they were being told was, the thing we have to worry about, the major threat to American interests in Latin America, it's not communism or organized labor, it's liberation theology. Because liberation theology is making some of the same demands for social justice, asking some of the same questions about inequality, but it's doing it in terms that are clear and understandable for the whole population. Everybody here can, you know, knows the basic biblical message of love your neighbor and, you know, the rich won't get into heaven and so on. And asking these questions in terms that are clear and simple and that can provide a kind of basis for more sophisticated analyses of exploitation, injustice, and so on. And couching it in the terms of an institution that had traditionally been a bastion of the establishment and the elite. The Catholic Church, one of the great ideological bulwarks of the colonial regimes in Latin America, a very important part of the Duvalierist machinery, because Duvalier purged the Catholic Church and stacked it with his own people. To see something like that be turned over into a force for radical change, basically become a kind of agent of something like a social revolution, this was a major, major threat. And the Americans are freaked by that. And I think that's very clear and it's very understandable. It's also a threat that's made on the basis of an institution, a big, powerful, wealthy, transnational institution, the Catholic Church, with links in all these different countries, where there was a capacity then for something like a transnational movement that was deeply, deeply threatening. And I think a large part of what's happened in kind of religious politics in the last 20 years is an attempt to stifle and contain that threat of liberation theology. You see it in the Vatican, you see it with the selection of Pope John Paul II and Cardinal Ratzinger, two of their major crusades is to stifle liberation theology. You see it with the revival of the religious right in North America, in the United States in particular. In Latin America, you see it in particular with the profusion of right-wing evangelical churches, which multiply like mushrooms in a place like Haiti and also in Guatemala and other places. In the 1970s, there were very few, there were virtually no right-wing evangelical churches. There were the Baptists and Seventh-day Adventists and so on, but now there are 500 plus little, small, right-wing evangelical churches, very fragmentary, very divided, very factional. But one of the things that unites them is that they hate the Catholic Church, and they hate liberation theology. I'm not, by the way, not making a plug for the Catholic Church particularly, but the message of liberation theology was something that I think was very powerful. Haiti is the only place up until now, up until Fernando Lugo's election recently, where a liberation theologian was elected president of the country twice. And this is very important, I think. One of the measures of the success of the stifling of liberation theology is that, at least in the circles that I travel in, it's really vanished. People don't talk about liberation theology very much. The academic work that I do is partly bound up with post-colonial studies, as it's called, and liberation theology does not figure very high on the agenda. So those are three reasons why, when RC comes back to power with a powerful parliamentary majority and without an army to act there as a kind of bulwark of last resort, that the elite was, I think, understandably nervous and worried that this might again set in motion a modest, practical process for social change. And that provoked, and I'm going to try and pull this together now quickly, I realize I've been talking already too long, it provokes a new strategy for containment. And I'm just going to summarize this and we can then move to discussion, and I'm sure people have comments or questions and can take some of these points further then. There are four main planks, I think, of the new strategy, and this is a model that I think we're going to see replicated in other places too. Some of them are very familiar, some of them are slightly new. The first is economics. It's a straight economic assault. RC is elected, the United States immediately suspends all international aid, and it uses its power to interrupt all other international aid to Haiti too. Loans that have been agreed by the main development bank, Inter-American Development Bank, that had been agreed previously, had been agreed under Preval before RC is elected in 1997-98 for $140+ million in precise, particularly in four different areas: education, irrigation, so on, agricultural, infrastructure projects, that were a crucial part of the Lavalas project of rebuilding and developing parts of the agrarian economy in particular. This money that had already been agreed is never dispersed. The Americans freeze it in total violation of the charter of the Inter-American Development Bank. I don't think there's any precedent for this. By itself, it's an international crime. In addition to that, they block the disbursement of there were $400+ million in additional loans that had been promised by the IDB, which again never materialized. That's the first thing. This has a very serious consequence. The budget in Haiti, the federal budget, the government budget in Haiti, is about $350 million on its own, something like that, which is an absolutely ridiculous sum. That's the average municipal budget, at least in the UK, of a town of about 100,000 people. All right? So if a whole country with 8 million plus people has to survive on a budget of $350 million, if you then suspend all international aid, which typically in a typical year is that much again, you effectively cut the budget in half, right? And that's what happened. So Lavalas comes to power having made some promises of investments and changes and so on, and those programs don't materialize. That by itself is a serious setback. There's understandable disappointment. And I should say parenthetically that despite that, and I go into this in a little bit of detail in the book, but there's lots of other stuff you can find online, despite that, The second Aristide administration managed to accomplish quite a lot. You know, they relaunched their literacy program, they continued building schools, they continued to invest in health. They have several medical clinics, a new hospital, a new medical faculty, which is kind of incredible with a Cuban assistance. One of the most remarkable things, I think, in the Aristide's administration, the Cubans maintained a very active relationship, sending 900 or so medical staff to work with the Haitian Ministry of Health. These kinds of things were done, but it was not as much as had been hoped. So there was definitely a popular disappointment in that the government wasn't able to follow through on some of its plans. That's the first thing, then, economic assault. The second was the development of some kind of para-political opposition, right? Remember that Lavalas comes into power, they wipe out the parties and their opponents in the election. What the United States then does, in particular with help from the European Union, Canada to some extent, is they repackage the losers of those elections as the real democratic alternative in Haiti. This is a kind of spectacular coup. These are people who, collectively, maybe had 15% of the vote. And it's a group, they're packaged together in a group called the Democratic Convergence, rather beautiful name for what they were. And basically it's everybody under the sun who doesn't like the fact that they lost the election in 2000. From the far right, Duvalier East, ex-army people, to the far ex-left, you know, former communist people who, by this point, were quite happy to work with, you know, Jesse Helms or whoever it was who might give them a little support. And these people are rebranded as the true voice of democracy in Haiti, in total, you know, defiance of reality. And they are given an effective veto on what the government can do, because the United States imposes agreement on the government. The government basically is told that you must agree with the opposition, a series of compromises, in order to have any of this international money released to you. So and the government, rightly or wrongly, agrees to many of these compromises. Some of the first things they do is they accept to have opposition members in their own cabinet. You know, how many people, imagine Tony Blair, if you're familiar with someone like Tony Blair, you know, who had a massive majority in Parliament, but who won not even just about 40% of the vote, let alone 70% of the vote. Can you imagine Tony Blair accepting, you know, some of his political enemies in his own cabinet? You know, this is just inconceivable. In any case, Aristide accepts some of these guys. He accepts that the opposition will have more representation than they deserve in the Electoral Council, which is a very important institution in Haiti. He accepts that the next round of elections will be brought forward earlier than is scheduled, so that the opposition will have another crack at the whip. He makes concession after concession. The opposition refuses every single one. There are more than 20 internationally sanctioned agreements with the opposition, mainly through CARICOM, the Organization of American States. And again and again and again, the government makes compromises and concessions. The opposition says, no, no, no. That article that you mentioned, Option Zero, that was the slogan of the opposition. We will accept no compromises as long as Aristide remains president. And incredibly, the international community accepts this line. And right down to the last minute, the week before Aristide's overthrown, Roger Noriega shows up along with Denis Coderre and various others and presents a last-ditch, you know, a package that the opposition and the government is supposed to accept. And it involves Aristide allowing the opposition to choose the prime minister, who then, it's a little bit like France, the prime minister then chooses the rest of the government. You know, this is a very big concession. He would lose control of the police. This would be given again to the opposition under the supervision of the international community. He basically lost all his power. Aristide says, you know, j'accepte tout de suite. You know, so without conditions, I say, in a word, yes. And that's a direct quote, pretty much. The opposition says, no, 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 we're not prepared to make any concessions. Aristide has to go. And incredibly, Noriega, Colin Powell, all follow suit. Say, oh, okay, well, I guess, you know, there's nothing to be done. Aristide has to go. So that's the second strategy. The third is to buttress these political losers, to call them that, with a paramilitary option. The army has been disbanded, but some of the soldiers who were part of that army are still available for recruitment. And they are duly recruited and retrained in the Dominican Republic, a small number of them, under the operational command of none other than Jodel Chamblin, the guy who was the point man for FRAP back in the first coup, with the cover provided by the media face of this operation, a police officer, a very, in fact, senior police officer, Guy Philippe, who had himself received special training in Ecuador in what is widely considered to be a branch of the School of the Americas in Ecuador back in the first coup, along with several of his friends, he becomes the kind of public face of this new insurgency. And these guys launch hit-and-run attacks on the government. It starts in July 2001, and it runs all the way through the whole of Aristide's second administration. The typical pattern is to attack an isolated police station, kill a couple of people, assassinate a government official, create a certain amount of panic and tension, and goad people into making some kind of militant response. And that was clearly the main objective, I think, was to push people so that their backs were against the wall, so that when provocative political protests began late in 2003, the situation might boil over into a state of kind of anarchy or unrest. The US could then call it too insecure, there's too much insecurity to have new elections, this is exactly what they said, let alone to give out some of the internationally accredited money to the government, and that in this climate of insecurity, chaos, anarchy, the good old imperialist powers could go in and protect the poor Haitian people from the tyranny that was attacking them. That was the real, I think, objective of the paramilitary wing of this operation. It's like a low-level version then of the Contras. And over the course of 2003, this becomes increasingly important, and they start increasing the rate of attacks. At least around 35 or 40 or so people are killed in the last months of 2003. And it turns into a full-scale military insurgency in early February 2004. We can come back to that maybe later. Just summarizing, there's a last component. So we have then an economic component, we have a para-political component, we have a paramilitary component, and the last, and in a way the most interesting and original, although in a way it's still also very familiar, is a kind of ideological humanitarian component, where a cluster of different agencies and institutions, human rights groups, NGOs, experts on development and alternative economics and so on, are brought in to one way or another to demonize and discredit the government, and to present the government in particular as complicit in human rights abuses. That was the emphasis. Corrupt, tyrannical, but in particular, a government that could be characterized as a human rights catastrophe. At the time, Amnesty International was describing the government as locking Haiti into a continuous cycle of violence. Human rights groups, Human Rights Watch talked about it as a worsening human rights situation, and this was a relentless emphasis. And groups like NCHR, the National Coalition for Haitian Rights, various other human rights groups, backed up by charities like Action Aid, Christian Aid, as well as Canadian NGOs like Alternatives and Rights and Democracy, FOCAL, Concertation pour Haiti, based in Montreal, various others, collude in this description of the government as tyrannical, violent, and corrupt, and the opposition, this little cluster of people, the Democratic Convergence, and a civil society front for the business community called the Group of 184, are branded as the kind of voice of the democratic alternative. Right? Civil society, that is trying to struggle to break free of the grip of this terrible tyranny. I just want to end by mentioning how far from the truth this picture is. If you look, in reality, at the actual amount of political violence, you have under Duvalier, I mentioned, the standard figure, possibly 50,000 people killed by Duvalier's Makouts. You have another 1,000 or so people who die, in the army, when the army takes over. The last years of the 1980s, you have another 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, probably 5,000 people who die in the first coup. Another 3,000 or so people who die in the second. How many people die under Aristide? And the best evidence that I've been able to find is that somewhere between 10 and 30 people might have been killed for broadly political reasons. And when we say broadly political reasons, these are deaths that took place in complicated circumstances where different groups are fighting mainly for things like turf. I would really describe them more like political turf wars or economic turf wars, sometimes between small political, sort of quasi-political groups, kind of mafia-type groups in some cases, that have no clear relationship to the government itself. I don't think there's any evidence at all that there was a deliberate government-sponsored campaign of violence. The so-called chimères, you might have heard that phrase, of gangs that were described often as a kind of reincarnation of the Tonton Makouts. This is pure propaganda. We can talk about, there's a film that tries to make this point called The Ghost of Cité Soleil. We were talking about this earlier today. I would love, we can come back to this maybe in the questions. There's no evidence for this at all. I feel like I have a reasonable grip of this now. I've talked to quite a lot of people. The best evidence that there is, the most incriminating evidence there is, to show that Aristide's government was complicit in the arming of these so-called chimères, consists in the assertion, and I think it's true, that they sent some of these people in Cité Soleil, several dozen possibly, up to the town of Gonaïves to try and regain control when the open military insurgency started in February 2004. And that meant that they handed out perhaps 50 or so handguns to a small group of people in Sidi Soleil, sent them up to try and bolster the police, to try and regain control in the town of Gonaïves. Which, under the circumstance, I think was a reasonable, in fact, understandable thing to do, and perhaps they should have gone considerably further along those lines because they failed to regain control of Gonaïves. And that failure cost the country very, very dearly. But that is, as far as I know, the extent of it. In terms of the number of people killed by chimères, the number of opposition political activists who were killed by the chimères, the evidence there is that there was virtually none. As far as I'm aware, there were these demonstrations that were fronted by this para-political opposition, working in particular with ex-army people. They start in late 2003. They go on for 2 months, where there are open demonstrations calling for the government to be overthrown. And they are met by much, much larger, angry counter-demonstrations from the poor neighborhoods in Port-au-Prince who are worried, with good reason, about what would happen if the government's overthrown. In all of these clashes, and there were clashes, there were vocal, occasionally violent clashes. I'm aware of 2 people who died, 1 on each side. And that's 2 people too many. But if you bear in mind the situation and the context and the history and the awareness that people have of what is likely to happen if the army regains control and if Aristide is overthrown, the fact that 1 opposition protester is killed in these riots and demonstrations is an astonishing fact of the level of discipline in the popular movement. I've talked far too long. We can pick up the thread of what happens after the coup, perhaps in the discussion and the comments that you might have to add. Thank you very much.